There's a moment, and I've seen it happen to a lot of people over the years, not just her, where a room full of professionals goes completely, utterly quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, not the respectful kind, the kind of quiet that happens when something enters the room that doesn't fit the mental picture anyone had formed, and every brain in that room quietly short-circuits trying to reconcile what it expected with what it's actually looking at. That kind of quiet happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, at a joint special operations training facility in Virginia. The kind of Tuesday that smells like wet concrete and bad coffee and someone's leftover MRE from the night before. The sky outside was doing that gray flannel thing it does in October on the East Coast, where you can't tell if it's going to rain or just threaten to rain all day as a form of psychological warfare. Which, honestly, felt appropriate. Her name was Lieutenant Reyes. Mara Reyes. And the first thing anyone noticed about her, the very first thing, before anyone registered the way she moved or the way she held herself, or the particular stillness she carried like a second skin, was that she was small. 5'4" on a good day. Maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. Dark hair cut military short. Brown eyes that didn't blink as much as other people's eyes blink. She walked into the briefing room at 05:30 with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a paper cup of coffee in her other hand. And the 17 Navy SEALs already seated at the long table looked up from their own coffee cups and their tablets and their quiet conversations, and the room went into that particular silence I described. One of the senior operators, Chief Petty Officer Dale Novak, 12 years in the teams, deployments on 3 continents, a scar along his jawline that he'd stopped explaining to people, later described it to me this way. I thought she was lost. I genuinely thought she had the wrong room. I was about to say something nice about it because she looked, I don't know, she looked calm, like she wasn't nervous about being in the wrong room, which was maybe the first sign that something was different about her. He didn't say anything nice about it. Nobody said anything. She sat down at the far end of the table, put her coffee down with a small, precise movement, and opened a tablet. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't look around the room to take stock of who was there, or gauge how people were reacting to her presence. She just started reading whatever was on her screen. That was the second thing people noticed. The stillness. Mara Reyes had the kind of stillness that made other people feel like they were fidgeting even when they weren't. Later, one of the instructors told me he'd spent a full 40 seconds just watching her sit there before he realized he was doing it, and then he'd felt vaguely irritated with himself for noticing. The briefing started at 0600. A 2-star general named Whitfield, who had the military bearing of someone who was born saluting, walked in and stood at the front of the room and explained, without much preamble, what the next 3 days were going to look like. Joint evaluation exercise. Simulated counterterrorism operation. Interagency cooperation assessment. All of that meant, we are going to watch you perform under stress and judge you accordingly. And, if you fail, we will be pleasant about it, and the report will not be pleasant. General Whitfield ran through the operational parameters, the ROE, the scoring criteria. He mentioned the phrase individual assessment phase twice, which was the part that mattered most. The part where each operator would be evaluated independently on a specific high-stress scenario. He didn't mention Mara by name. He didn't need to. By that point, every SEAL in the room had already figured out, on their own, that the situation was unprecedented. A female operator in a joint evaluation exercise with Tier 1 assets. That hadn't happened before. Not at this facility. Not in this configuration. After the briefing, when General Whitfield had left and the room had broken into smaller clusters of conversation, one of the SEALs, a guy named Torres who I later spoke with, compact and dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of casual confidence that comes from being very good at very dangerous things for a very long time, walked over to where Mara was still sitting, still reading her tablet. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "Torres," he said, by way of introduction. "Reyes," she said. "So." He sat on the edge of the table in that way that guys who are very comfortable in rooms like this always sit on tables. "Udea." "I can't discuss my assignment," she said. He smiled. Not unkindly. "Right. Sure. I'm trying to figure out where you're coming from, because you're clearly not." He gestured vaguely. "Not what?" she said. The way she said it wasn't hostile. It wasn't aggressive. It was genuinely, almost pleasantly, curious, which somehow made it worse. Not from the pipeline, he finished, which was the diplomatic version of what he'd started to say. No, she agreed. I'm not. She looked back at her tablet. He waited for more. There wasn't more. He eventually got up and walked back to his cluster of teammates and didn't say anything about the conversation, but his expression, according to the person who told me this story, said everything. Let me back up. Because the thing about Mara Reyes is that her story doesn't start in that briefing room. It doesn't start with the SEALs or the evaluation exercise or that gray Tuesday in October. Her story starts somewhere much smaller and much darker and much earlier, and if you don't know where it starts, you don't understand anything about what happened later. She grew up in a place called Laredo, Texas, border city. One of those American places that is its own specific thing, its own accent, its own logic, its own rules of gravity, hot in a way that doesn't ask permission, the kind of heat that is simply there, a presence, a given, like the river and the border and the military convoys and the sound of helicopters at night that you learn not to flinch at, because flinching is a thing you can't afford. Her father was a border patrol agent. Her mother was a school teacher who also ran a small tutoring service out of their house on Saturdays because one income wasn't quite enough, and she didn't believe in things being quite enough. She believed in things being more than enough, which is a different philosophy and a harder one to maintain. Mara was the middle of 3 kids. Older brother Rafael, younger sister Ceci. The kind of family where dinner was always at 7 and loud, and you learned to talk fast or you didn't talk, and where the word soft was never used as a compliment. Her father used to say, "The world doesn't care what you're made of until it has to." He said it so often that by the time Mara was 12, she'd started finishing the sentence for him in her head before he got there. She said it later, much later, when someone asked her what shaped her, and she said it without irony, which means she'd actually absorbed it rather than just memorized it. There was an incident when she was 14. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because she doesn't spend a lot of time on it. And this is her story. And her instinct for what deserves time and what doesn't is generally better than mine. The short version, she was walking home from school, 3 in the afternoon, which is a time that sounds safe and is not always safe. 2 older boys from a rival school's neighborhood, a situation that escalated faster than 14-year-old situations are supposed to escalate. She ran. Not because she was scared, though she was scared, which is the honest version, but because running was the right tactical choice, which was a word she didn't have yet, but the instinct was already there. She ran, and she got away, and she got home, and she sat in the bathroom with the door locked for 45 minutes thinking about what had happened, and what could have happened, and the specific, precise distance between those two things. When she came out, her father was in the kitchen. He looked at her once, the way her father looked at things, which was the way a person looks who has spent years reading situations for danger before the situation announces itself, and he said, "What happened?" She told him. He nodded. He made her a cup of tea, which was not a thing he usually did, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he said, "You did the right thing." "I know," she said, "but you're going to learn to do the right thing differently," he said. That Saturday, he drove her to a gym on the south side of town that smelled like rubber mats and decades of other people's sweat. It was run by a retired Marine named Ochoa, who had a face like a topographic map of somewhere difficult, and a philosophy about self-defense that could be summarized as, the goal is not to win. The goal is to make losing no longer an available option. She trained there for 4 years. By the time she was 18, she was teaching the Saturday morning class for the younger kids. She enlisted the week after graduation. Not SEAL training. Women weren't in the SEAL pipeline then, and the policy was still in the process of its slow, grinding evolution. She went in as intelligence, which is where you go when you are exceptionally perceptive and have a talent for pattern recognition and an ability to sit very still in a room full of information and pick out the one thread that matters. She was exceptionally good at it. She spent 4 years in intelligence, then a transition, then training that wasn't on any official pipeline but happened anyway because sometimes institutions move faster than their own paperwork. Because sometimes a person's skills exist at an intersection that the system's job descriptions haven't caught up to yet. That's the part I can't be too specific about. What I can tell you is that by the time she walked into that briefing room in Virginia, on that gray October Tuesday, Mara Reyes had been in 7 countries in the previous 3 years. She had logged more hours in active fieldwork scenarios than many operators twice her age. And she carried exactly none of that as a visible fact about herself, which is either the most remarkable thing or the most calculated thing, depending on how you read people. I've thought about it a lot. I think it was both. The first day of the evaluation was what they called the orientation phase. Nobody really uses that word without a certain amount of professional condescension attached to it. Orientation implies that you are new to something. In a room full of Tier 1 operators who have been doing this for a decade, the orientation phase is mostly theater, a series of exercises designed to establish baseline data, to see how people move and communicate, and make decisions under low-grade stress, before you turn up the heat. The SEALs did fine. They always did fine in orientation. They were built for orientation, which is a very uncharitable way of saying that they were so good at everything that the baselines came easy. Mara did fine too. Which was the problem? From the perspective of the observers. She wasn't spectacular. She wasn't visibly better than anyone else. She moved through the obstacle courses and the tactical puzzles and the communication drills with a kind of quiet, unhurried competence that landed in the middle of the pack statistically and didn't announce itself as either impressive or worrying. Chief Novak, the one who'd thought she had the wrong room, told me later that this was the point where he'd filed her mentally in a specific category. Not dismissive exactly, something more careful than that, he said. I figured she was capable. I figured she was here for some kind of diversity evaluation metric, which I wasn't against on principle. I thought I'd figured out what I was looking at. He paused when he told me this. I was wrong about what I was looking at, he said. Obviously. The second thing that happened on the first day, after the orientation exercises, after the afternoon debrief, after the meal that nobody really wanted because the facility food was aggressively mediocre, was small. It happened in the corridor outside the equipment bays, late, around 2100 hours, when most of the operators were either asleep or doing the particular kind of quiet pre-sleep maintenance that people who live in their bodies professionally tend to do. One of the younger SEALs, a guy named Breckenridge, 26, just finished his first full deployment. One of those guys who is undeniably skilled and also undeniably very aware of his own skill, which is a combination that can go either way, said something. I won't reproduce the exact words because they're not worth the space. The spirit of it was, she doesn't belong here, and tomorrow will prove it, and it's nothing personal. It was absolutely personal, in the way that most things that are described as impersonal are actually personal. 2 other SEALs heard it. One of them, a veteran operator named Salas who had been in the teams for 9 years and had, at this point, decided that Breckenridge was going to either grow up or wash out in the next 18 months, said nothing. He just looked at Breckenridge for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who is deciding not to spend energy on something. The other one, Torres, the same one who'd talked to Mara that morning, said, quietly, "Keep that to yourself." Breckenridge shrugged. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," he said. "You're saying what you're thinking," Torres said, which is a different thing. That was the end of that particular conversation. Mara wasn't there for it. She was in the equipment bay at 2100, doing something that the overnight security log would later record as unauthorized extended equipment familiarization, which is a bureaucratic way of saying she was in there in the dark, alone, handling every piece of equipment in the room by feel, with the lights off, until she knew each piece the way you know things you've touched 10,000 times. She stayed until midnight. Nobody told her to. Nobody told her not to. Day 2 was different. Day 2 had a name. The instructors called it the maze, which was literal. There was an actual physical maze, a modular structure built into one of the facility's largest interior spaces, a 3-dimensional course of corridors and rooms and obstacles that shifted configuration between runs. But it was also metaphorical, because the maze was the exercise where they stopped measuring baselines and started measuring decisions. The scenario: An active threat environment. Multiple moving hostile elements. Friendly assets to protect. Limited intelligence. Degraded communications. Time limit. You'll find out when you've either completed the objective or been eliminated by the simulation system. Each operator ran it alone. This was the part that mattered. This was the part where Chief Novak had, privately, the day before, told one of the evaluation supervisors that he anticipated a significant performance gap between the SEAL operators and Lieutenant Reyes. Not cruelly. Practically. He'd framed it as a logistics concern. If the gap was significant, it would affect the evaluation's overall data set. The evaluation supervisor, a woman named Colonel Garza who had been running this facility for 4 years and had seen approximately everything, had listened to Novak's concern and said, "Noted." That was all she said. The runs started at 0800. Torres went third. He completed the scenario in 22 minutes, eliminated 8 of 10 hostile targets, protected all friendly assets. A very good run. The kind of run that goes in a report with highlighted text. Novak went 7th, 20 minutes flat, 9 of 10 targets. 1 friendly casualty from a simulation-assessed crossfire decision. Still good, still report-worthy. But Novak was harder on himself than the numbers were. Breckenridge went 11th. He was in there for 31 minutes and came out looking like he'd argued with the building and the building had won. He'd gotten his targets, 6 of 10, but the friendly casualty count was higher than it should have been, and his decision-making under the communications degradation had, apparently, gotten aggressive in a way the simulation hadn't rewarded. He didn't say anything when he came out. Salas, who went 12th and ran a clean 24-minute scenario, looked at Breckenridge's face when he came out and decided very sensibly not to comment. Mara went last, 16th of 16 operators. She stood at the entry point for approximately 30 seconds before they opened the door for her. In that 30 seconds, she was still. Not nervous still. Not performing calm still. Just still. The way water is still, before something moves through it. Colonel Garza was watching from the observation deck above the maze. She told me later, "I've watched a lot of operators at that entry point. Most of them are doing something, shifting their weight, checking equipment, rolling their neck. Whatever their personal pre-run ritual is. She was just present, like she'd already started the run without moving yet. The door opened. She went in. And then 18 minutes later, 18 minutes and, by the timing system's record, 43 seconds, the system registered scenario completion. 10 hostile targets eliminated. All 6 friendly assets intact. 0 friendly casualties. For a full 4 seconds after the completion signal, the observation deck was quiet. Then Colonel Garza said, very quietly, to the junior officer standing next to her, "Run the system check. I want to make sure the sensors calibrated correctly." The junior officer ran the check. The sensors had calibrated correctly. Garza looked at the results for a long moment. Then she said, not to the junior officer, not to anyone in particular really, "Well, just that. Well," which is a word that, in the right context, contains everything. The door to the maze opened, and Mara walked out, and the assembled operators who were standing around waiting, because they always waited, because you always wanted to see how the last runner came out, looked at her, and she looked at them, and the first thing she did was look around for the water station and walk directly to it. She drank a full bottle of water. Then she turned around. Chief Novak was the first one to speak. He said, and I'm told his voice had a quality in it that he later struggled to describe. Not disbelief, not admiration exactly. Something between the two that doesn't have a name yet. 18 minutes. It wasn't a question. It was him saying the number out loud to hear how it sounded. 1843, she said, because she was precise about numbers. Novak nodded slowly. Torres, to his credit, was smiling. Not a small, polite smile. A real one. The kind that happens when someone does something that recalibrates your understanding of what's possible. "How?" Torres said. It came out as one word, not really a question. More like an exhale. Mara thought about it for a moment, or appeared to think about it. It was hard to tell, with her, whether the pause was genuine consideration or whether she'd already decided what she was going to say, and was deciding whether to say it. Pattern. she said eventually. The maze shifts configuration, but it shifts on a mechanical logic. The motor system controlling the configuration changes has a cycle interval. Once you identify the interval, you can predict the configuration at any point in the run. You're not navigating what's there. You're navigating what will be there. Silence. You figured that out how? Silas said. Yesterday, she said. In the equipment bay. More silence. Breckenridge opened his mouth. He didn't say anything, which was, possibly, the most growth he'd demonstrated in the entire evaluation. That evening, Novak sat in the facility's common room with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands and a tablet in his lap that he wasn't reading. Silas came in and got his own coffee, and sat across from him, and they did what veterans do, which is nothing in particular, together, for a while. She reverse-engineered the maze cycle, Novak said eventually. Yeah, Silas said. In the dark, at night, alone, without being told it was an option. Yeah. And she did it before the exercise started, so by the time she went in, she already had a map, Silas finished. Novak was quiet for a moment. I was wrong, he said. Silas didn't say I know, or obviously, or any of the things that would have been true but unnecessary. He just said, we've got one more day. I know, Novak said. He picked up his coffee, put it down again. One more day, he said. And I want to see what she does with it. There's something that happens inside institutions when their assumptions get disrupted. Not immediately. The disruption happens, and then there's a lag. A processing delay. And then the institution starts doing what institutions do, which is try to fit the disruption into a framework it already owns, to normalize it, to find a way to understand it that doesn't require the institution to change anything fundamental about itself. This is not a cynical observation. It's just a description of how systems work. Systems are built on their own history. When something new comes in that doesn't fit the history, the system reaches for its tools and its language, and its existing categories, and it tries to build a shelf for the new thing. Sometimes the new thing fits on a shelf. Sometimes it doesn't. Mara Reyes did not fit on a shelf. The morning after the maze, the evaluation moved into its final phase, what the facility coordinators called the scenario integration exercise, which was a very careful bureaucratic phrase for something much simpler. It was a live test, simulated, but live, and not in the controlled interior environment of the facility. Out in the field, the 40-acre training grounds north of the main building, which contained a mock urban environment, 7 connected structures, multiple access points, a network of underground passages that the facility's permanent staff called the burrows, and a surrounding perimeter of rough terrain that included 2 dried creek beds and a stand of Virginia pine that smelled, in October, exactly like what you'd want a serious place to smell like. The scenario was this. A hostile force had established a command and control element in the central structure, 6 secondary positions in the surrounding buildings, a high-value personnel element, friendly, captured, in the basement of the eastern structure. Mission parameters: neutralize the command element, secure the friendly asset, minimize collateral. Get out. The scenario was designed to be run by a 4 to 6 person element. They had 17 operators. General Whitfield announced, at the morning briefing, that the day's exercise would be run in 2 phases. Phase 1, 2 combined elements, roughly 8 operators each, running the scenario simultaneously on parallel configurations of the training ground. Standard evaluation. Phase 2, and this was the part that changed the energy in the room, was individual. 1 operator. Solo infiltration and objective completion. The individual phase, General Whitfield said, is voluntary. Any operator who wishes to attempt the solo configuration of the scenario can submit their name by 1,000 hours. The individual scenario will be run at 1400. He paused. The parameters are the same as the group scenario. The only difference is the asset count. He didn't elaborate on that immediately. One of the younger operators, not Breckenridge, one of the others, said, "Sir, what does that mean? Same asset count as the group scenario?" 10 hostile targets, General Whitfield said. 6 friendly assets, 1 operator. The room did the math. The room did not love the math. 10 hostile targets in a 7-structure urban environment, with 6 friendlies to protect, for a single operator. In the field, not in a controlled interior course. Torres leaned slightly toward Salas and said, very quietly, "That's a death scenario." "It's a simulation," Salas said. "It's a death by simulation scenario," Torres said. But he wrote his name down. Salas wrote his name down. Novak wrote his name down. 4 other SEALs wrote their names down. Mara wrote her name down. The Phase 1 runs happened in the morning, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because they're not the center of gravity of this story. They went well. The SEALs operated the way SEALs operate, which is to say with a level of coordinated efficiency that makes the rest of the world feel slightly disorganized. There were 2 runs. Both came in under 30 minutes. Both secured the friendly asset. Both took casualties in the simulation, 1 per run, which was considered acceptable performance. Mara ran in the second group. She was positioned as a secondary element operator, which meant her specific role was overwatch and communications relay. She did it well. Not spectacularly. She was playing a supporting role, and she played it the way a supporting role should be played, which is invisibly effective. The element completed the scenario, and she was part of why, and no one in her group could have pointed to a specific moment where she'd been the difference, and she'd done it that way on purpose. I know this because Torres mentioned it to me afterward. He said, "She was in my element, and I kept watching her because I was curious, and I couldn't catch her. She was always exactly where she needed to be, exactly when she needed to be there. But she wasn't. She wasn't performing anything. Does that make sense?" I said it made sense. Most people in a joint evaluation, especially if they know they're being watched, they're performing the job. They're doing the job, and showing they're doing the job. She was just doing the job. The performance layer wasn't there. I asked him what he made of that. He thought about it. "I think it means she's been doing the job for a long time. In places where the performance layer wasn't an available option," he said. Places where the only thing that mattered was the actual thing. At 12:30, the 7 operators who'd signed up for the individual phase gathered at the staging area north of the main building. The weather had changed. The morning's gray flannel had thickened into actual clouds, low and specific, and there was a smell in the air that Novak described to me as pre-rain in pine country, which is a very specific smell if you know it, a kind of cold vegetable sharpness that makes the back of your sinuses tingle. The temperature had dropped about 6 degrees since morning. The dried creek beds were going to be muddy by afternoon. None of this was incidental. None of this was accidental. Field conditions were part of the exercise. The 7 operators were Torres, Novak, Salas, Breckenridge, 2 others named Harwick and Kim, and Mara. They would run in order. Random draw. Torres pulled position 1. Mara pulled position 7. Last again. Torres later said he thought about that. The randomness of her ending up last on both the maze and the individual field scenario. He said he didn't think it was random. He said he thought she'd engineered it somehow, though he couldn't explain the mechanism. When I pressed him on this, he said, "I know that sounds paranoid, but watch where she stands at the drawing. Watch her hands." I didn't see the drawing, but I believe him. Torres ran first. He took the scenario in 28 minutes. 8 of 10 targets. All friendly assets secured. Clean run, decisive movement. Good use of the underground passages he'd identified in the pre-run orientation. His performance brief afterward was 3 paragraphs, all of them complimentary. He came out of the scenario looking like a man who had done something well and knew it. Not arrogant, satisfied. There's a specific physical quality to a person who has just done their job at the level they're capable of, and Torres had it. He walked back to the staging area, drank water, watched the next runners with clear eyes. Novak went second. He was slower, 32 minutes, but his target count was 9 of 10, and his friendly asset protection was clean. Novak was the kind of operator who had traded peak speed for reliability over his career, and the trade showed in numbers like this. He came out with mud on his boots from one of the creek beds and a satisfaction that was quieter than Torres's. Salas ran third. 30 minutes, 8 targets. He'd made one significant error in the burrows, had gone right instead of left at a specific junction, That had cost him time and led to the 2 missed targets. He knew it before anyone told him. He came out already mentally rerunning the decision. Harwick and Kim ran 4th and 5th. Their numbers were competitive. Mid-20s for time, 8 to 9 target counts. Nothing extraordinary, but nothing disappointing either. Breckenridge went 6th. I want to be fair to Breckenridge here. He was 26 years old. He'd been in the teams for 3 years. He was good. Not great yet. He didn't have the years for great. But functionally, genuinely skilled, with the physical package that the SEAL selection process is designed to filter for, and the tactical thinking to match. What he had working against him in this particular exercise was not ability. It was the morning. It was what had happened in the maze the day before. It was the specific cognitive weight of knowing that the next runner after him was her, and that she had run the best time in the maze, and that she had done it in a way that had been, tactically speaking, embarrassing for him not to have thought of first. He ran 26 minutes, 9 targets, 1 friendly casualty. A good run? A very good run, actually, by any objective measure. But his face when he came out, I heard about this from 2 separate people, was a complicated face. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something conflicted, like a man doing arithmetic on feelings he wasn't ready to finish. He stood at the edge of the staging area, and he waited. Mara went in at 13:47. The protocol was the same as the maze, a 30-second pre-run observation period at the entry point. The evaluation supervisors would later note, in the post-exercise report, that she used the full 30 seconds to stand at the eastern edge of the staging area and look at the mock urban environment from the outside, not moving, not adjusting equipment, looking. The way you look at something when you already have a question about it and you're waiting for the thing to answer. Colonel Garza was on the observation platform again, which was elevated above the training ground's northern boundary, and gave a partial overhead view of the mock environment. She had 2 junior officers with her. She had a timing system and a sensor log, and a communications relay that would track Mara's position and the simulation target's positions in real time. What she did not have, and would later describe as the strangest professional experience of her career, was any ability to predict what was going to happen. With most operators, Garza told me, even very good ones, you watch them at the entry point, and you form a working hypothesis about how they're going to run it. The hypothesis is sometimes wrong, but you have one. You're reading their body language, you're reading the choices they made in the pre-run orientation, you're forming a model. She paused. With Reyes, I had no model. I had watched her for 2 days, and I understood the data. I knew her numbers from the maze. I knew her performance in the group phase. But at that entry point, I had no mental picture of what was about to happen, which was unusual. That was very unusual for me. At 13:48, the timer started, and Mara moved. What happened in the next 18 minutes and 11 seconds? 18:11. Not 18:43. She'd gone faster. Is the part of this story that people always want me to describe in detail. And it's the part that is simultaneously the hardest and the easiest. Easiest because she completed the scenario. 10 targets. 6 friendlies secured. 0 casualties. Best individual time of the exercise. Hardest because the how. The sensor log captured it in data. Position changes, timing intervals, simulation target eliminations logged sequentially. And the data tells a story that is, frankly, hard to believe if you read it without context. She didn't enter from the primary access point. She went around the western edge of the mock environment, through the stand of Virginia Pine, and entered via the burrows, the underground passage system, through an access point that no other operator had used during the exercise. The access point was partially concealed by a rusted drainage cover that was technically part of the course, but that the pre-run orientation had described as non-functional. It was non-functional as a drainage element. It was very functional as an entry point. This was the first thing. She used the burrows to move under the mock environment, coming up through 2 interior access points that put her inside the structure network, without having crossed any of the open ground sight lines that the hostile elements were positioned to cover. From below, she could hear. That's not a metaphor. She could literally hear the simulation elements. The motion triggered audio and movement systems that represented hostile positions through the floor of the structures above her. Position and activity. She used sound to map what she couldn't see. This was the second thing, and the one that Novak, who would spend the next week thinking about it, said was the part that got under his skin. She used the environment the way water uses a landscape, he told me. Not fighting it, not imposing on it, finding its own logic, and moving along that logic. I've seen a lot of operators in a lot of environments. I've never seen anyone use a training ground like that before. Like the ground itself was working with her. The target eliminations, logged in the sensor system as sequential events, time-stamped, happened in a pattern. Not random, not reactive. Sequential by structural relationship. She cleared the burrows first, which eliminated 2 targets and opened the underground access to the central structure. Then, she came up inside the central structure and cleared it. 3 targets, the command element, without coming above ground until she was already inside. Then she used the internal connecting points the course designers had built between the structures, which every other operator had used as secondary corridors, and she used as primary ones, to move east and clear the remaining 5 targets in a pattern that, when you look at the sensor log's positional data, describes a single continuous line of movement that doubles back on itself exactly once. 1 loop, 10 targets. She never stopped moving. She never reacted. She only acted. Which is the difference between someone who is responding to a situation and someone who is moving through a situation they've already built inside their head. 6 minutes and 40 seconds into the run, she reached the eastern structure's basement and secured the friendly asset. She didn't leave immediately. The sensor log shows her stationary in the basement for 54 seconds. What she was doing in those 54 seconds is not captured by the sensor log. When I asked her, much later, she said, listening for the last 4 targets. I needed to know where they were before I came above ground. If I came up wrong, I'd have had to react. And in a real scenario, reacting with an asset in your custody is, she paused. You don't want to react with an asset in your custody. So she waited. 54 seconds in the basement with the friendly asset, doing math with sound. Then she came up, cleared the last 4 targets, and walked out. 18 minutes and 11 seconds. She walked back to the staging area, and the 6 operators standing there turned to look at her, and nobody said anything for a moment. Torres was the one who spoke. He said, and I have this from multiple sources, he said, time. One of the evaluation supervisors nearby said, 1811. Torres looked at Mara. Mara was doing what she'd been doing at the water station after the maze, looking around for the water, finding it, walking to it. She drank. All 10? Torres said. The supervisor said, all 10. 6 friendlies intact. Torres said nothing. Salas said nothing. Novak looked at the ground for a moment, then looked up and said, Lieutenant Reyes. She looked at him. Chief Novak, she said. It was a strange moment. He didn't say anything else immediately. He was doing something with his face that a face does when a person is working through something, and what he was working through was, according to him, when he told me this story, the specific experience of having been wrong about something significant, and having to decide, in front of other people, how to be wrong about it. He was a man who didn't have a lot of practice being wrong. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for anything I said, for something I thought. She looked at him. Accepted, she said. Just that. Accepted. Not you don't need to. Not it's fine. Not I didn't notice. All the softening language that would have made it easier for him, and less true for her. She just said, accepted. Novak nodded once, slow, like a man finalizing a transaction. Breckenridge was standing slightly behind the group, and slightly to the left, and he said nothing for the rest of the staging period. He was watching her the way people watch things they don't fully understand yet, but have decided to understand, which is a different quality of attention than dismissal, and a much more productive one. Colonel Garza came down from the observation platform 30 minutes after the final run. She walked to where the operators were gathered for the post-exercise discussion, and she stood at the edge of the group, and she listened to the debrief for a while without adding to it. The debrief was, according to everyone who was there, unusually free of the competitive score comparison that these exercises usually produce. Usually there's a current running through the post-exercise discussion that is about individual ranking and relative performance. There wasn't that current. Instead, there was something that one person described to me as collective recalibration, which is an awkward phrase but the most accurate one. They were all thinking, together, about what they had just watched. At a pause in the discussion, Garza spoke. She said, "I want to hear from Lieutenant Reyes about the pre-run orientation. Specifically, I want to hear what she was looking at when she was standing at the eastern edge for 30 seconds. The group shifted slightly so Mara was more visible. She said, "The drainage cover." Garza said, "Tell me." The pre-run orientation described it as non-functional, Mara said. The description was accurate for one purpose and inaccurate for another. I wanted to see if the cover would hold a person's weight. At the angle I had from the eastern edge, I could see the sedimentation pattern around the frame. The pattern indicated the cover had been opened recently, within the last 6 months, I'd estimate, which meant it was functional enough for repeated use. Even if it wasn't functional as a drainage point, Garza looked at her. "You identified a concealed entry point from sedimentation patterns," Garza said. "Yes, ma'am. From 30 seconds of observation at range." "Yes, ma'am." Garza was quiet for a moment. "When did you decide to use the burrows as your primary route?" she said. "During the Phase 1 run this morning," Mara said. "I was in the overwatch position, and I was tracking my element through the course, and I noticed the way the hostile elements oriented to above-ground movement. Their coverage angles were built for above-ground entry assumptions. The burrows weren't in their coverage model." "And you ran the scenario in your head this morning," Garza said. "It wasn't exactly a question." "I ran several versions," Mara said. The group absorbed this. Torres, who I mentioned was smiling after the maze. The real smile. Torres made a small sound. Not a laugh. Something between a laugh and an exhale. Like the release of something. "Several versions," he said, mostly to himself. "The environmental audio," Garza said. "Using sound to position the targets through the floor. That's not a technique in the official training documentation for this exercise." "No, ma'am." "Where did that come from?" A pause. "It came from a different kind of work," Mara said. Garza looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, and didn't push on it, which was the right call. Some answers contain more than they give, and the containing is the point. That evening, for the first time in the evaluation cycle, the group ate dinner together. Not in clusters. Not in the careful social geography of a professional group that is still figuring out its internal map. Together. At one long table, in the facility's dining room, with a meal that was slightly better than aggressively mediocre because someone had ordered in pizza, which is a diplomatic gesture that transcends rank. Mara sat in the middle of the table. Not at the end. Not in the corner. In the middle. She didn't engineer this, as far as anyone could tell. It was just where there was space when she came in. But in the way that positions in a group sometimes mean something separate from where you physically put your body, the middle felt right. She ate and she talked. Not much, but enough. She answered questions, mostly about tradecraft, mostly the ones that were operationally genuine rather than socially probing. She asked a few questions herself, about specific deployment environments, about what the team's communications protocols looked like under severe conditions. The questions were good. The kind of good that tells you something. Breckenridge sat at the far end of the table. He ate. He didn't say much. At one point, Torres, who was sitting to Mara's left, and had been in intermittent conversation with her about nothing in particular, and also about several things that mattered, looked down the table at Breckenridge and caught his eye for a moment. Breckenridge looked away. Torres looked back at Mara. She was listening to Salas describe something about a mountainous operating environment, with that particular quality of attention she had. Not polite attention, not performed interest, actual listening. The kind where you can tell the information is going somewhere. Torres picked up his coffee. Later, walking back to the billets, Novak fell into step beside him, and they walked in the particular companionable silence of people who've been in enough hard places together that silence isn't uncomfortable between them. "She's going to keep doing this," Novak said. "Yeah," Torres said. Going into hard places and doing things that don't have names yet. Yeah, Torres said again. They walked. I want to be on her element, Novak said. If there ever is one. Torres nodded. It was the highest thing he could have said. Here is what the official after-action report from the joint evaluation exercise said about Lieutenant Mara Reyes. LT Reyes demonstrated exceptional proficiency across all evaluated competency domains. Individual scenario performance exceeded projected parameters. Recommend advanced integration assessment. 3 sentences. 3 very careful, very measured, very bureaucratically appropriate sentences that do the minimum amount of work necessary to acknowledge that something significant happened without actually saying what the significant thing was or why it mattered. I've read a lot of after-action reports. They are, as a genre, not designed for truth. They are designed for record. Truth and record overlap sometimes, but not always, and in the space between them is where most of the actual story lives. The actual story, in this case, was considerably longer than 3 sentences. Colonel Garza wrote a separate document, not an official report, not a formal evaluation, a memo, that most bureaucratic of forms, the memo, which is what you write when you have something to say that the official channels aren't built to hold. The memo was addressed to General Whitfield and 2 other individuals whose names I was not given access to. It ran 7 pages. I was shown 3 of them. The first page began, "The below reflects my professional assessment, independent of the formal evaluation metrics, of LT Reyes's operational cognitive profile, as observed during the joint assessment exercise. I believe this profile represents a capability set that does not map cleanly to existing classification schemas and warrants dedicated analysis." Dedicated analysis. That phrase, in the language of the institution, is significant. It means, this thing doesn't fit in the boxes we have, so we need to build a new box. And building a new box takes time and attention, and the willingness to admit that the existing boxes aren't sufficient. Institutions are not always willing to do that. Some are. Garza's memo, the 3 pages I was shown, was a methodical breakdown of what she'd observed. The maze performance, the field scenario, the specific cognitive mechanisms she'd identified, environmental audio mapping, mechanical cycle pattern recognition, structural topology reasoning, pre-scenario simulation, what she called running multiple versions, the ability to hold a large and dynamic operational picture in working memory without visible stress indicators. The last of the 3 pages ended with this paragraph. Of particular note, LT Reyes's performance did not decline under conditions of isolation, information scarcity, or time pressure. In most operators, at least one of these 3 stressors produces measurable degradation. In LT Reyes, the data suggests these conditions produced a focusing effect, narrowing cognitive load to operative essentials with greater efficiency than in a reduced stress environment. In my assessment, this represents an operational psychology that inverts the expected stress performance curve. The implications for placement and deployment are significant and should be addressed by personnel with appropriate domain expertise. Go. The stress performance curve inverts. I spent a long time thinking about those words. What Garza was describing, and what the people I spoke with who knew Mara's broader history confirmed, carefully, and with certain specifics withheld, is something that researchers who study high-performance operators in genuinely extreme conditions have documented occasionally, but never been able to reliably produce or train for. There are people, a very small number, statistically anomalous, for whom the narrowing of options that high-stress environments produce is not a burden but a clarification. Most of us operate better with more information, more time, more options. Stress takes those things away, and performance degrades accordingly. For a specific, rare type of cognitive profile, stress removes the irrelevant. It strips the noise. What's left is the signal. And the signal, for this kind of person, is enough. More than enough. Because they were built, through biology or experience or the specific alchemy of the two, to operate at the level of pure signal. Mara Reyes operated at the level of pure signal. The maze. Remove the corridor complexity, identify the cycle interval, Move to the next position. Strip and advance. Strip and advance. The field scenario. Remove the above-ground entry assumption. Identify the burrow's access. Use environmental audio for positioning. Run the pattern. 1 loop, 10 targets. Done. She wasn't fearless. That's the wrong word. And the wrong idea. Fearless implies the absence of something. What she had was the presence of something. A very specific kind of functional relationship with fear that allowed her to take its information without taking its interference. Her father used to say, "The world doesn't care what you're made of until it has to." By the time the world had to care about Mara Reyes, she'd been building for it for 19 years. 2 weeks after the evaluation, something happened that I wasn't present for and that I've reconstructed from 2 separate accounts. Mara was back at her regular assignment, which was not in Virginia. She was in a city whose name I won't use and working on a project that doesn't have a public description. The work involved, as her work often did, a lot of sitting in rooms and listening and reading and building pictures out of pieces. She got a phone call. The phone call was from an office that, for the purposes of this story, I'll call the office. The office is the kind of entity that exists at the intersection of several agencies and doesn't appear on organizational charts. Its personnel don't have business cards. When they call, the number is a number, but it isn't, if you understand what I mean. The call was brief. The office had read Garza's memo. The office had, in fact, already known about Mara Reyes before Garza's memo. Garza's memo had simply moved a timeline. The person from the office said, "We've been watching your career for some time." Mara said, "I know." This was not a guess. She had known for approximately 14 months that she was being watched. Not because anyone had told her, but because of a series of very small, very careful data points that, taken individually, meant nothing, and taken together described a pattern of institutional interest that she recognized the shape of. The person from the office said, "We'd like to discuss a different kind of work." Mara said, "What kind?" The person said, "The kind that doesn't have a name yet." In the weeks between the evaluation and that phone call, Mara had gone back to her regular life in a city I won't name, and she had done what she always did, which was to work and be still, and not talk about herself much. Her sister Ceci called her on a Sunday. Ceci lived in San Antonio now, married, 2 kids, a job she liked but didn't love, and a life she loved but didn't always say so. She and Mara talked every 2 weeks or so, the way sisters talk when they are close without being demonstrative about it. "How's work?" Ceci said. "Fine," Mara said. "Did anything happen?" "Always something happening," Mara said. "You know what I mean," Ceci said. Mara was quiet for a moment. "It was a good week," she said. Ceci knew her sister. She heard the particular quality of the quiet before the sentence. She said, "Tell me later when you can tell me." "Yeah," Mara said. "Are you eating?" "Yes, Ceci." "Real food or?" "Real food." "Okay." A pause. "Raphael says hi." "Tell him hi. He wants to know if you're coming home for Christmas." Mara thought about this, not about whether she wanted to. She always wanted to. Home was still home. The smell of Laredo in December was still the exact smell that meant something specific and warm and irreplaceable. But about whether the work would allow it. "Maybe," she said. Ceci knew what maybe meant. She said, "Okay." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Ceci's older kid's school thing, a restaurant that had opened in San Antonio that Ceci thought Mara would like, the particular impossibility of their mother's Thanksgiving expectations, and then said goodbye and hung up. Mara sat in her apartment for a while after the call. She was on a chair by the window. The window faced east. The city outside was doing its evening thing. Traffic, lights, the specific ambient sound of a place with a lot of people in it pursuing a lot of different things in a lot of different directions simultaneously. She didn't think about the evaluation, particularly. She thought about the work that was waiting, and about the phone call she was going to get, and about Christmas in Laredo, and whether her mother would make the tamales she'd been making every Christmas, since before Mara could remember. She thought about her father's saying, "The world doesn't care what you're made of until it has to." The world had needed to know. Now it knew. She wasn't sure what came after that. The knowing, the institutional knowing, the official awareness, the thing that Garza's memo had set in motion, was a thing that opened doors and also closed them, changed the nature of the work, changed what was being asked of her and what she was being trusted with. She wasn't afraid of it. She was, in the precise and honest way that she applied that word to herself, alert to it. The post-evaluation period also produced something I hadn't expected to find when I started researching this story. A series of conversations between the SEAL operators from the evaluation and people in their own lives, wives, partners, teammates from other deployments, that were, in their way, as revealing as the official data. Novak talked to his wife the night he got back from Virginia. He'd been married for 11 years to a woman named Dana, who had her own career and her own considerable competence, and who had spent 11 years married to a man who was not always good at articulating things that happened in the field. They had a system, Dana told me, where she would wait for him to find the words, and he would eventually find them. It took him 3 days. On the third evening, he said, "I met someone on this last evaluation who made me think about what I do differently." Dana said, "In a good way or a bad way?" "Good," he said. "A hard good." She said, "Tell me." He said, "She did something I've been doing for 12 years, and she did it in a way that made me see it differently. Not better or worse. Differently. Like seeing a familiar road from a different elevation." Dana thought about this. "Who is she?" She said. "An operator," he said. "A different kind." "What kind?" He was quiet for a moment. "The kind that finds the door before you know there's a room," he said. Dana was quiet too. Then she said, "Are you going to work with her?" "I hope so," Novak said, which was a more significant statement than it sounds. From a man who had, 3 days earlier, told an evaluation supervisor he'd anticipated a significant performance gap. Torres was less circumspect about it. Torres was single, lived in an apartment in Virginia Beach with 2 teammates in the adjacent units, and his primary social outlet was a Thursday night card game that had been running for 6 years and that he described as the most honest conversation he had on a regular basis. He told the card game. He told them about the maze. He told them about the field scenario. He described the 1843 and the 1811 in chronological order, and he described specifically, and with the kind of detail that Torres brought to things he cared about, the moment she'd come out of the field scenario and said, "Accepted to Novak." The 4 people at the card game, all of them military, 3 of them naval, 1 army, listened. One of them, a man named Green, said, "And you all had her figured for a +1. "Most of us," Torres said. "Yeah. What changed your mind before the maze?" Torres thought about it. "How she sat," he said. "In the briefing room? First morning. The way she sat when she was reading her tablet. Most people, when they know they're being watched, sit differently. She just sat. Like the room's opinion of her wasn't a variable she was tracking." Green picked up a card. "That's composure," he said. "It's more than composure," Torres said. "Composure is a performance of not caring." She actually didn't care, which is different. The distinction sat in the room for a moment. "She coming back?" Green said. "I don't know what she's going to," Torres said. "I think she's going somewhere they don't name things yet." Green put down his cards and looked at Torres for a moment. "You're going to want to work with her," he said. "Already do," Torres said. "Breckenridge. I spoke with Breckenridge last, because he was the hardest to get to. Not geographically. He was still at the Virginia Beach team's area, available, in theory reachable. He was just not, immediately and obviously, the kind of person who wants to talk about being wrong. He took a while. He agreed eventually, and we talked for about 90 minutes, and he was, I want to be fair here, more honest than he needed to be. He said, I had her figured for a metric, a box check, a thing the institution was doing for political reasons that had nothing to do with capability. I said, and after? After the maze? He exhaled. I didn't know what to do with it. That's the honest answer. I had a framework for understanding how people do this job, and she didn't fit it. And when you're 26, and you've spent 3 years being told the framework is correct, he stopped. You get defensive of the framework, I said. You get defensive of the framework, he agreed. Because if the framework is wrong, then, yeah, you have to rebuild something. I asked him what he'd rebuilt. He was quiet for a long time. I rebuilt the part where I assumed I understood what this looks like, he said finally. What the job looks like. What a person who can do it looks like. He shook his head slightly. I had a picture in my head. She didn't match the picture. The picture was wrong. He paused. The hardest thing about that conversation with Torres, the night before the maze, was that I knew it was wrong when I was saying it. Not that she could do the job. I didn't know that yet. But I knew the thing I was saying wasn't something I was proud of. Why did you say it? I asked. Long pause. Because it was easy, he said, and the framework made it feel okay. I didn't push past that. It was enough. It was more than enough, actually. More honesty than most people bring to the question of why they were wrong about something important. The last thing I want to include in this section of the story, before I get to what comes after the phone call, after the office, after the conversations and the reports and the memo and the card game, is something small that I've thought about many times. On the last morning of the evaluation, before the formal closing debrief, there was an informal breakfast. The kind that happens when 17 people have spent 3 days in close professional proximity, and the formal evaluation is done, and nobody wants to be the first to leave, but nobody's sure how to exist in the in-between. Mara was there. She ate eggs and drank coffee and talked to people who came to her, which was most of the 17. She was different in that in-between space than she'd been during the exercise, not different in a fundamental way, but softened slightly around the edges. She laughed twice, once at something Salas said, and once at something she said herself, that I don't know the content of. At one point she was standing near the window with a second cup of coffee looking out at the training ground, which in the morning light looked different from what it had been. Less ominous, more like just a field, and some buildings, and the stand of Virginia pine at the northern end. Novak came and stood near her. They were quiet for a moment. He said, "What's next for you?" She looked at the training ground. "Something different," she said. He nodded. "Worth it?" he said. She thought about this. Really thought about it. In the way she thought about things. With a quality of attention that made you feel like she was taking the question seriously enough to deserve a real answer. "Yes," she said. "Just that." He nodded again. Slower this time. "Good," he said. And they stood there for another moment. Two people who had started 3 days ago in a certain relationship with each other. Assumption and its correction. And were ending it in a different one. Looking out at the same field. The coffee was still warm. Outside, the Virginia pine stood in the morning like it had been there forever. She said yes to the office. This surprises exactly nobody who has followed the story to this point. But I want to spend a moment on the yes, because the yes was not simple, even though it was certain. The yes meant a specific kind of leaving. It meant leaving the assignment she was in, which had its own rhythms and relationships. People she'd worked alongside long enough that they knew the way she thought, which is a form of professional intimacy that gets overlooked until you lose it. It meant a new cover designation, a new operational geography, and the particular type of isolation that comes with doing work that you can't describe to most of the people in your life. She called her father before she said yes to the office. Not to ask permission. She didn't need permission, but she called him the way she'd been calling him since she was 14 years old, and something significant was happening, because he was the one person in her life who could hear the shape of a decision without needing all its content. He answered on the second ring. "Misha," he said. "Papa," she said. She didn't tell him what the decision was. She told him there was a decision. He was quiet for a moment. He was 61 now. Her father, still working but slower, with a bad knee from his border patrol years and a garden out back that he'd discovered late in life, and tended with the same attention he'd once given to everything more urgent. He said, "Is it the work you've been moving toward?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then say yes." She said, "It's harder. And more." "More what?" She was quiet. "More alone," she said. He was quiet too. The particular quiet of a father who understands something about his child that he can't fix and doesn't try to. Then he said, The things worth doing usually are. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing specific. The garden. Her mother's health, which was fine, which had been fine, which her father discussed with the reflexive gratitude of a man who had once briefly thought it would not be fine. A neighborhood situation he'd been navigating with his characteristic combination of patience and absolute refusal to be moved. Before she hung up, he said, "Your grandfather used to say something." "I know," she said. "I know what he used to say." "Tell me," he said. Not because he didn't know, because he wanted to hear it in her voice. She said, "Nobody looks at the ground between the footprints. They look at where you went, not how." A pause. "There you go," her father said. The office gave her 60 days to transition. She used 47. The first 3 weeks were administrative, the paperwork that precedes every institutional transformation, the form signing and the clearance updating and the quiet bureaucratic machinery that grinds when a person moves from one box to another and both boxes are classified. She did it without complaint. She did most things without complaint, including things that warranted complaint. Because complaint was a form of energy expenditure she evaluated for return before she made it. The 4th week, she traveled. I don't know all the places she went. I know some of them from context, a reference made in passing, a timestamp that implies a geography, the kind of negative evidence that builds a picture out of what is not said. I know she went somewhere north of somewhere else, and somewhere east of that. I know she met people. I know the meetings were the kind where you sit in rooms without windows, and you speak in operational shorthand, and you build a shared language out of the specifics of what you're about to do together. I know that by the end of the 4th week, she had a team, not a SEAL element, not an intelligence cell, something different. The kind of thing that Garza's memo had been gesturing toward when it used the phrase dedicated analysis. Something built to order around a specific capability set, which in this case was Mara's capability set, and everything that capability set implied about the kind of work that needed doing. The team had 5 people. I know 4 of their first names: Mara, Jiho, Sasha, and Dominic. I was not given the 5th. Jiho was Korean American, mid-30s, had a background in signals intelligence and also, improbably, in competitive chess, at a level that had gotten her recruited twice by organizations that valued pattern recognition in non-standard contexts. She was the one who, later, would describe working with Mara in the phrase that I think is the most accurate thing anyone said about it. She thinks in futures, not possibilities, futures. She runs the scenarios before they're scenarios. Sasha I knew less about. Russian-American background, technical specialist, the kind of person who was described by everyone else on the team as essential, without anyone being specific about what essential meant, which is usually the sign of someone whose work is foundational in a way that's hard to point to. Dominic was a former Marine raider who'd transitioned to intelligence work after an injury, and then transitioned again to wherever he'd ended up, which was here. He was the one with the clearest physical presence. Tall, unhurried. The kind of person who takes up exactly the amount of space that is available without seeming to impose. He and Mara had a professional dynamic that people on the periphery of the team described as almost frictionless, which is either a sign of shared training or of 2 people who think in similar enough structures that they can abbreviate, or, possibly, both. I'm going to describe one specific operation. I want to be careful here, because careful is what's required. The specifics of what the team did and when and where are not fully available to me, and what is available I have an obligation to handle with appropriate discretion. But there is one operation, about 4 months into the team's first working period, that I have enough information about to describe in a way that serves the story. I'll call it the building on the ridge. The building on the ridge was in a country I won't name, at an elevation that produced specific physical effects: a dry cold, a thinness of air, a kind of sensory amplification that one person who'd been in similar terrain described to me as everything louder and further away at the same time. The building had been used as a logistics node for a network that the office cared about dismantling. The mission was intelligence gathering, not direct action. This is an important distinction that gets lost sometimes in the telling of these kinds of stories. Not every operation at this level is about eliminating threats. Some of them, and these are often the ones that matter most, are about understanding, about sitting in the right place at the right time, and seeing what comes through. The building on the ridge required someone to get very close to it without being detected, to remain in observation position for an extended period, to document and transmit what they observed, and to leave without leaving evidence of having been there. The team had done the pre-operational assessment over 3 weeks. Jiho had been instrumental in the signals analysis, identifying a regular transmission window that created a monitoring gap in the building's electronic security. Sasha had done something with the communications infrastructure that I genuinely cannot describe because I don't understand it well enough. Dominic had run the route analysis. Mara ran the operation. She was in observation position on the ridge for 11 hours, not moving, not significantly. The cold was the kind of cold that is a character in the story, a presence that is both outside and inside, that you stop fighting at a certain point and simply allow, because fighting it costs more than you have. She saw what she needed to see. She transmitted it. She left. 11 hours. What came after the 11 hours? The intelligence that was built from what she observed. The operational decisions that followed. The downstream effects in a network that the office had been working to disrupt for a period I can't specify. That's not mine to tell. It's the kind of outcome that doesn't get announced. It's the kind of success that looks like nothing from the outside. But I spoke with someone who was in a position to know the downstream effects. Someone who sat in meetings where the information from the building on the ridge was used. And they said, carefully, with the particular choice of words of someone who is giving you truth in a bounded form, they said, it mattered. 2 words, it mattered. Which is another sentence that contains more than it says. Between operations, Mara existed. This is the part of these kinds of stories that usually gets skipped. The in-between, the ordinary time, the Tuesday afternoons and the Sunday mornings, and the slow weeks when the work is preparation, and the preparation is mostly quiet, and the quiet is the thing that most people who do this kind of work need to learn to survive. She ran. In the mornings, wherever she was, she ran. 5 miles or 6 or 8, depending on the terrain and the time available. Running was the thing she did that was purely physical, purely present moment, that required nothing of her except the body and the ground. She ran the way she did everything, without ornamentation, without performance, efficiently and completely. She read. She always had 3 books going simultaneously. 1 fiction, 1 history, 1 technical. The fiction varied. The history was mostly military history in the broad sense. Strategy, logistics, the engineering of conflict from its largest scale to its smallest. The technical book was usually something she was currently using in her work, or planning to use. She cooked when she had a kitchen. This surprised people who knew her, or would have surprised them if they knew about it. She was a good cook in the way that people who grew up in kitchens with someone who cooked seriously are good cooks. Instinctive, not fussy, with a specific relationship to flavors that had been formed young and didn't require recipes. Her mother's red chile, her grandmother's arroz. Things that took time and heat and patience, and produced something that tasted like a place. She called Ceci on Sundays when she could call on Sundays. "How's work?" Ceci said. On one of these calls, a Sunday in February, Mara was in a city whose name she couldn't use, in an apartment that was functional and not particularly warm, with a view of a street that was doing its normal weekend things. "Good," Mara said. "You sound tired," Ceci said. "I'm always tired," Mara said. "It's fine." Tired, or, Ceci. I know. I'm okay. I'm genuinely okay. A pause. "Is it interesting?" Ceci said. Which was the question her sister asked instead of "is it dangerous?" Because Ceci had decided years ago that asking the dangerous question was a form of fear that she wasn't going to impose on Mara, and interesting was the word that captured what Ceci actually wanted to know about her sister's life. "Yes," Mara said. "Like, actually interesting? Or, like every day I have to use a different part of my brain, and the part I used yesterday, I usually didn't know I had." Ceci was quiet for a moment. "That sounds," she said. "Yeah," Mara said. "Are you coming home for Easter?" "Maybe." Ceci knew. "Okay." They talked about the kids for a while, about their mother, who had started a garden of her own, apparently inspired by their father's late-life horticultural conversion, and who was approaching her garden with the same everything-or-nothing philosophy she brought to Thanksgiving, about Raphael's new job situation, which was complicated and which they both agreed wasn't their business to fix. Before they hung up, Ceci said, "Mara, yeah, I'm proud of you. I know I don't say it, but I am." Mara was quiet. "I know," she said. "I know you know, but I wanted to say it." "Thank you," Mara said quietly. The way she said things that were true and didn't need amplification. The team ran 7 operations in their first year. I know the number. I don't know all the details of all 7. The details I have come from Jiho and Dominic, both of whom I spoke with, and from documents I was shown in a controlled environment by someone who didn't tell me their name. Across those 7 operations, the pattern that Garza had identified in her memo, the inversion of the stress performance curve, the ability to operate at pure signal in high-noise environments, held. It held in the building on the ridge. It held in a situation 3 months later that involved a train station and a specific kind of crowd management problem that I will not describe more specifically. It held in a mountainous environment that required, as Dominic described it, the physical endurance of something that doesn't believe in limits, and the mental architecture of a chess grandmaster. He said that with admiration and a certain amount of frustration, because he himself was very good at what he did, and the frustration was the specific kind that comes from working alongside someone who is better at a thing you are also good at, which is a frustration that has no productive outlet, except to simply get better. He got better, he told me. Working with her changed the way I think in the field. Not because she taught me anything directly. She didn't. She doesn't teach. She just operates. And you either see what she's doing or you don't. I started to see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start asking questions about the environment that you didn't know you weren't asking. I asked him to give me an example. He thought about it. The audio thing, he said. In the maze, she used sound to position targets through the floor. I never would have thought of that because I wasn't thinking of the floor as a membrane. I was thinking of it as a barrier. She was thinking of it as a conductor. Once I knew that was a possibility, that floors conduct, I started thinking about what else conducts. What else I was treating as a barrier that might actually be a tool. He paused. The answer, he said, is almost everything. In the fall of their second year, the team got a new mission. I know less about this one. Not because it's more classified, though it may be, but because the people who were there are less willing to talk about it than they are about other things, which is its own form of data. What I know, the mission was longer than the others. It required extended deployment. The operational environment was different from what the team had worked in before. More complex, more populated, more variables in motion simultaneously. What Jiho said to me about it, in a conversation that was brief and careful, it was the hardest thing I've ever been part of, and the best thing I've ever been part of. Those are the same things sometimes. What Dominic said. I don't want to talk about the specifics. What I'll tell you is that she was the reason it worked. Not just her skills, her judgment. The call she made at the critical point was the right call, and I wouldn't have made it. I would have made a different call that I thought was right, and I would have been wrong. I asked him what the call was. He shook his head. Not that, he said. I let it go. What I know about the outcome, the mission achieved its objective. The office was satisfied with the outcome. The downstream effects, several of them, in several places, over a period of months, were of the kind that don't get announced. They mattered. The team had dinner after, somewhere warm. A restaurant that Jiho had insisted on, which was a thing she did. After operations, she insisted on meals in actual restaurants with actual service and actual wine, because the ritual of it was important to her, was how she reoriented to the ordinary world after a period of sustained operational intensity. They sat at a table that fit 5, and they ate, and they drank wine that was better than the occasion officially required. And they didn't talk about the work. They talked about Jiho's ongoing argument with her landlord about a window, about Sasha's brother's wedding, which was coming up, which Sasha had feelings about. About a hiking trail Dominic had been planning to run for 2 years and hadn't yet. About Mara's mother's garden, which had by this point produced what Mara described as an existential abundance of chilies. How many chilies? Dominic said. The number that makes a person reevaluate their relationship with chilies, Mara said. Which is what number? My mother hasn't decided yet. She's calling it a process. Dajiho raised her glass. To existential abundance. I started this story because someone told me about 18 minutes. Not the field scenario. Not the maze. A different 18 minutes. In a different context. That had gotten back to me through a chain of 3 people, who each knew slightly more than the person before them. The specific details of that particular 18 minutes are not available to me in a form I can verify, so I won't put them in this story, because unverifiable specifics in a story like this are worse than gaps. But the number reached me, and the number made me curious enough to pull the thread. This is what I found when I pulled it. Mara Reyes is 34 years old. She has been doing this work, in its various forms, in its various designations, with its various institutional names, and the one that doesn't have a name, for 12 years. She still runs in the mornings. She still has 3 books going simultaneously. She called her father last month from somewhere she can't name, and he told her the garden had produced its best yield and he was considering a second plot, which her mother was resisting on practical grounds, and also on the grounds that one plot of existential abundance was enough for any family. She's going home for Christmas this year. She was home for Easter. She sat at the table at 7 o'clock, and the meal was loud and fast, and you had to talk fast or you didn't talk. And at one point her father was telling a story about the neighbor's dog, and her mother was telling a different story about the garden to Ceci's kids, and Raphael was trying to show someone something on his phone, and Ceci's older kid knocked over a glass of horchata, and the resulting chaos was complete and brief and domestic, and entirely normal. Mara sat in the middle of it. She ate. She talked. She laughed at her father's story, which ran longer than it needed to but had a good ending. She was, for an hour at the table in Laredo, completely ordinary. That is the part of people like Mara that the stories don't usually include. The table, the horchata, the sister's kids, the father's garden, the specific and irreplaceable ordinary. I spoke with General Whitfield once. He's retired now, has been for about 18 months. He lives in North Carolina, has 2 dogs, does some consulting work for an organization he didn't want to name, and I didn't push on. He was generous with his time, which some generals are and some aren't, and which tells you something about the kind of officer he was. We talked for about an hour. He'd been at the facility for the evaluation. He'd seen the numbers in real time. Garza had transmitted them to him from the observation platform. He'd read Garza's memo. He said, "I want to tell you something about that memo." I said, "Tell me." "It's a very good memo," he said. "Very thorough, very accurate. And it does the thing that good memos do, which is it forces the institution to ask questions it wasn't planning to ask." He paused. "But the memo is also, it's a document about capability, about skill, about performance metrics and cognitive profiles and operational psychology, all of which are real, and all of which matter." Another pause. Longer. "What the memo doesn't address," he said, "is character, which is the more interesting question to me." I asked him what he meant by character in this context. He said, "She was in a room full of people who were, professionally speaking, dismissive of her. Not openly hostile, in most cases, but skeptical, with assumptions, and she knew it. She wasn't naive about it. She's not a naive person. She knew what the room's opinion of her was walking in." He stopped. "She went out there and she did the best work in the room," he said. "And she didn't perform it. She didn't make a show of it. She didn't rub it in anyone's face. She just did it, and then she accepted Novak's apology and went to get water." He shook his head slightly. That's a kind of discipline that doesn't come from training. That comes from character." I thought about what he said for a long time afterward. Character. The word is used so often that it has a tendency to lose its edges, to become a vague positive, a placeholder word for something good we can't quite name. But in Whitfield's usage, with the specifics of that room, and that evaluation, and that moment at the water station, it had its edges back. He meant, she could have made it about winning. She didn't. She made it about the work. The work was hers. The winning was beside the point. Torres stayed in the teams for another 2 years after the evaluation. He got out eventually, not because he lost faith in the work, but because he'd started a family, and the specific kind of absence that the work required had become a different kind of cost than it had been when he was 24. He does private sector security consulting now. He's good at it. He's in touch with Salas, who is still in. He's in touch at intervals with Novak, who has stayed in longer than most people expected, and who Mara, apparently, sent a message to when he made it to a specific milestone that I won't describe in detail. Novak told me about the message. He said it was short, which he would have expected. He said it was warm, which surprised him slightly, because warmth and her particular form of economy of expression don't coexist in the way most people's warmth does. He said, she wrote, and I'm going to try to remember this exactly. She wrote, 12 years is real. Well done, Chief. The door finds the right people eventually. And that was it. He read it 3 times. The door finds the right people eventually, he said. I didn't know what it meant for about a day, and then I remembered the thing she'd said to Garza about the drainage cover, about using the pre-run orientation to see the cover as an entry point instead of a drainage point, about finding the door that was there but wasn't being treated as a door. He was quiet. She was telling me I'd found it, he said. The right door. The right way to see the work. After 12 years. He shook his head. In 11 words. Breckenridge is 29 now. He's still in. Still with the teams. He's been on 3 deployments since the evaluation, each of them the kind of deployment that changes a person by adding weight to them. The good kind of weight that comes from having been trusted with something serious and not dropping it. He said, when we talked, that he thinks about the evaluation more than he'd expected to. Not obsessively. Not with regret, exactly. But it's there. I think about what she did in the maze, he said. I think about the pattern recognition thing, the cycle interval. Because I went back to that and I thought, why didn't I look for that? I'm good at that kind of thing. I do that kind of thing. Why didn't I do it there? He answered his own question. Because I was looking for the thing the exercise was designed to test, he said. I was inside the framework. I was doing what the exercise was set up for. And she stepped outside the framework and saw the exercise itself as the thing to analyze. He paused. She wasn't doing the maze, he said. She was doing the maze's designer. I hadn't heard it put that way before. But it was accurate. It was probably the most accurate single sentence I'd heard about what she'd done. I try to do that now, he said. Not always successfully, but I try. Step outside the frame. Look at the frame. He smiled slightly. 3 years of team training got me to the same place, he said. She did it in 30 seconds at the entry point. There was something in the way he said it. Not bitterness. And not entirely admiration either. Something that had moved past both of those things and arrived somewhere more honest. She made me better, he said. She didn't try to. She didn't even care, honestly, whether she did. And watching someone do the work that well, whether you want it to or not, it makes you better. I want to tell you something about the 18 minutes. Not the field scenarios 1811. Not the mazes 1843. The other 18 minutes, the ones I started with, the ones I can't put specifics on. What I can tell you is this. The person who told me about it, the first link in the chain of 3 that led me to this story, described it in a single sentence. They said, she went in alone and came out with what mattered, and nobody knew she'd been there. That's all they said. I've turned that sentence over in my head many times since. The precision of it, the compression of it. She went in alone and came out with what mattered and nobody knew she'd been there. It applies to the building on the ridge. It applies to the train station situation I can't describe. It applies to the 7 operations in the first year and whatever came after. It applies, in a different register, to the field scenario in Virginia. She went in alone, came out having done what needed to be done, and the only evidence that she'd been there was the numbers on the sensor log. It applies to the whole of her. She goes in alone. She comes out with what matters, and the world keeps turning, and the operational effects ripple outward in ways that don't get announced. And most people who are alive and well because of what the world cannot see, they don't know. They'll never know. The specific shape of their safety has no face attached to it, no name, no record they can access. Just the fact of being alive. Just the ordinary Tuesday morning, the coffee, the commute, the small aggravations and satisfactions of a life that continues, because somewhere, in a place that doesn't have a name on a map, in a building on a ridge or a training ground in Virginia, or a city I can't tell you the name of, someone went in alone and came out with what mattered. The last time I spoke with someone about Mara, not Mara herself, someone who knew her, it was Dominic, in a brief phone call, 3 weeks before I finished writing this. I asked him how she was. He said, "Good. I think. We don't always. The nature of the work is, we're not always in regular contact." I said, "When you do talk, what do you talk about?" He thought about it. "The work," he said, "sometimes, and the other stuff." He paused. "She asked me last time about my daughter. My daughter's 2 now. She asked if she was walking yet." "Is she?" I said. "Running," he said. "Apparently she skipped walking and went straight to running." He said it with the quality of a person who is amazed by something, in a way they haven't processed yet, which is the quality of every parent talking about their kid but doesn't get less real for being common. "What did Mara say?" I asked. "She laughed," Dominic said. "She said that was about right." I thought about that. About the 2-year-old who skipped walking and went straight to running. About the woman who'd spent the middle school years in a gym on the south side of Laredo, learning to make losing no longer an available option. And the Border Patrol agents saying about what the world cares about. And the drainage cover that was functional for a different purpose than anyone had designated. And the 30 seconds at the entry point. And the 11 hours on a cold ridge. And the table in Laredo with the horchata. And the 2 loud family. And the father's garden that had more chiles than anyone needed. And the sister who said, "I'm proud of you," and meant it. About the room that went quiet when she walked in. About what was in the room when it went quiet again after she'd done what she did. That kind of quiet. The quiet that happens when something enters the room that doesn't fit the mental picture anyone had formed. The quiet that means, recalibrate. The quiet that means, what you thought you knew about what's possible, revise it. She's out there right now. Somewhere. Doing the work that doesn't have a name. Going in alone. Coming out with what matters. Not for credit. Not for recognition. Not for the room's approval, or the institution's acknowledgement, or the record that will eventually be classified in a folder in a building that ordinary people will never see. For the work. Because the work is what there is. Because the door found her, and she walked through it, and on the other side the ground was hers. Nobody looks at the ground between the footprints. They look at where you went. Not how. But the how is everything. The how is her.